So in this last video, we are going to talk about the different ways in which organisms can obtain their food. There's a lot of vocabulary here, so you're going to want to pause the video and write down these notes. Alternatively, a picture of these notes can be found in the Google form.
We know that all organisms need energy, and all organisms get energy from food. When organisms take in food in the form of glucose and they combine it with oxygen, they can make energy in the form of ATP. All organisms can be classified into a group depending on how they obtain their food. Producers are organisms that are able to make their own food, like plants that can make their own glucose using the process of photosynthesis, while consumers must directly or indirectly ingest organisms to obtain their energy or food. Plants and algae are producers that make their own food by absorbing carbon dioxide and water and using sunlight for photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants make glucose, which all organisms need to produce energy, and they release oxygen into the atmosphere. During photosynthesis, plants use sunlight to make their own food. Consumers can be classified by the different types of food they eat. Carnivores are the organisms that eat other organisms. A great white shark, for instance, might eat a seal for its high fat content. So carnivores obtain their nutrients by eating other animals. Not every carnivore is going to be as ferocious as a great white shark. Some carnivores could be organisms like an anteater, which eats other ants. As long as you eat other animals, you are considered to be a carnivore. The second consumer group we'll talk about are called herbivores. Herbivores are organisms that eat vegetables or other plant matter. So here you can see a cow. Cattle are herbivores because they obtain nutrients by eating producers, also called plants. Let's move on to our next consumer category. Omnivores eat everything. They obtain their nutrients by eating both consumers and producers. Otherwise, what we mean is omnivores eat both plants and animals. Here you can see a bear. A bear is considered an omnivore because it eats plants like berries, but bears can also eat animals like fish. Generally, humans are also considered omnivores because most humans eat both plants and animal products. The last category of consumer we're going to talk about are called decomposers. Decomposers are really important because they break down dead organisms and they help recycle matter back into the environment. Decomposers are really important in the ecosystem. One example of a decomposer is fungus. Fungus can help break down dead organisms and return their nutrients to the soil. Another very important decomposer is bacteria. Bacteria are important decomposers that help break down dead material and return the nutrients back into the ecosystem. Now let's take a closer look at organism classification and interaction in an ecosystem using the help of the amoeba sisters.
have a favorite animal? I went through many favorite animals when I was a kid. The velvet ant, the sea pig, silky bantam chickens. Okay, that one might actually still be my favorite. What I loved most, though, was collecting facts about different animals. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I could tell you how much a silky bantam chicken weighs, on average, or where you would find a sea pig. But of course, one fact to always know about your favorite animal is what your favorite animal eats. Are they herbivores, which means they eat plants? Carnivores, which means they eat meat? Omnivores, which means they eat meat and plants? And there are more categories than this. Even though all my favorite animals ate different things, they all had one thing in common. They were all heterotrophs. Generally, animals are heterotrophs, which means they consume organic matter. It doesn't matter whether they are eating plants, meat, or both. They are heterotrophs, also known as consumers. Along with animals being heterotrophs, so are fungi, some protists are heterotrophs, and some bacteria, and some archaea too. But not everything on this planet is a heterotroph. Do you have a favorite plant? That may be less popular than having a favorite animal. Plants are generally autotrophs, which means they make their own food. To be more specific, they make organic substances, such as glucose, from inorganic substances, such as carbon dioxide. If talking about plants, their source of energy to do this is light. Plants are also known as producers. Their food is glucose, an organic substance which they produce in the process of photosynthesis by using inorganic substances such as carbon dioxide. Oh, and even the plants known as carnivorous plants still produce their own food using photosynthesis. It's just that carnivorous plants can also digest insects to obtain nitrogen. Nitrogen is an important element that living organisms need, and it turns out that most carnivorous plants live in areas where there is low nitrogen in the soil.
When we were little, we loved nature shows. One reason was because we didn't have cable, and it was one of the few things we actually got a TV signal for that didn't require you to dance around with a TV antenna for reception. But the other reason was that, of course, it was cool science. It often showed animals that we couldn't see in our own backyard doing some awesome things. But then it would be a little traumatizing when, inevitably, some predator would walk in and gobble the unsuspecting animal up. Truly, action scenes with predators and prey are often shown in nature shows because it's all part of nature's food chains. A food chain starts with a producer. A producer is an organism that is an autotroph, which means that it makes its own food. A plant, for example. The plant is eaten by a primary consumer, this grasshopper here. Consumers are heterotrophs, which means that they need to feed on other organisms. The primary consumer is eaten by a secondary consumer, this frog. The secondary consumer is eaten by a tertiary consumer, this snake, and the food chain can keep going. Notice how the arrows are supposed to point in the direction of the one doing the eating, which makes sense because that's the direction of the energy flow. You can also arrange this same food chain into an energy pyramid. The producers are at the base here, in trophic level 1. They actually contain the most energy. What is crazy to think about is the primary consumers here, in trophic level 2, they actually only store 10% of the energy from the producers. Meaning, let's say the plants here had 10,000 kilocalories. That's an energy unit of energy. Well, the next level here, the primary consumers in trophic level 2, they would only store 1,000 kilocalories of energy. So where did the rest of the energy go? Much of it is lost in heat or undigested. If you go up to the secondary consumers in trophic level 3, that would be only 100 kilocalories of energy. So as you go up each trophic level, it's roughly only 10% of the energy from the trophic level below that will be stored. Back to our food chain. Notice that, like a domino effect, if something is removed, let's say the grasshoppers, you can harm the others because they might not have enough to eat. You really have to consider the relationships among organisms in a food chain. In fact, even if you took out the apex predator in this particular food chain, which is the snake, you could end up with an excessive population of frogs, and so many frogs that it's possible they wouldn't have enough grasshoppers to even support them. This is actually not a very good model because in real life, this snake probably doesn't just eat frogs. It probably eats rabbits and birds too, because an ecosystem doesn't typically have a single food chain. Instead, it has more of a food web. A food web is made up of multiple food chains that interact together. So notice how now we have multiple food chains here tied in with our original to make a food web. The beauty of a food web is that it shows more interactions among a variety of producers and various level consumers. It also can show biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of organisms, all types of organisms, living in a given area. The size of the area that we're talking about, as well as the climate of the area, directly affect the biodiversity that is present. Biodiversity can contribute to the sustainability of an ecosystem. What I mean by that is, let's say there was a decrease in the amount of small birds in this food web. Well, it's likely that will be harmful to other organisms. However, it is not the only thing that the snakes feed on. They have other options because of the biodiversity. The snakes also eat rabbits and they eat frogs. So because of this biodiversity, the ecosystem might be more resilient to changes such as these and possibly recover. However, these changes can still have detrimental effects, and it's why it's critical to protect ecosystem biodiversity. High biodiversity has a lot of other benefits. They can include economics, and we'll need another video to really touch on all the benefits of high biodiversity. So, if we were to ask you which of our examples here had more biodiversity, our food chain here or our food web, you would definitely want to pick the food web. One last thing, there are some organisms that we left out of our food webs and food chains, but they're kind of a big deal. Decomposers. Decomposers are heterotrophs since they do eat other things, even if the things they're eating are dead. Decomposers include organisms like bacteria and fungus. Technically, if we were to draw them in, then every arrow here would eventually point to them.
Thanks to the Amoeba Sisters, by now you should be able to distinguish between producers, consumers, autotrophs, and heterotrophs. And you should be able to classify organisms as herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, decomposers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. And now you've done it, make sure that you've watched the videos, you've taken good notes, you completed your work in the Google form and hit submit. Post pictures of your notes to Google Classroom. And as always, write down any questions you have and bring them to office hours with your teacher.